So we're on lecture 5 at this stage, which is the second lecture on defending God, the real God, and getting rid of this caricature we've created. The Godfather is considered by many film critics to be the greatest movie ever made, and it's based on a novel. The movie was made in 1972. It was based on a novel from 1969 written by a man called Maria Puzo, and the movie was directed by Francis Ford Coppola, who actually has a restaurant and a winery just about 10 miles north of where I live here. And it's a story of, most of you have seen this movie, it's a story of intrigue and murder and vendetta and conspiracy and gory mayhem among mafia families. And in it, there are two main villains. There is Don Vito Corleone, who's the mafia crime boss, and he's played by Marlon Brando in the movie. And then there's one of his sons, Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino. So they're the characters in the novel and in the movie. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment that somebody goes in to watch this movie in 1972, and he's under the mistaken surmise that this actually is a documentary, that it's not a movie, it's a documentary about two mafia families. And so when the movie is finished, he sets out to find Brando and Pacino and bring them to justice for all of the mayhem and all the murders they've created. He's totally convinced that he'd been watching a documentary in which Marlon Brando and Al Pacino are these mafia mobsters who've created mayhem all around them. And he finally runs them down, and he drags them in front of a judge, in front of a court system, and he puts them on trial for all the murders that they've created. Now, this basically is, what happened in the first half of this book that I've written, that I basically put Marlon Brando and Al Pacino on trial, except Marlon Brando is God and Al Pacino is Moses. And so I haul these guys into court, thinking that this movie, these stories that were told is actually a documentary, and that it's an actual journal of what God did and what Moses did. And so now in the second half, I'm dismantling the prosecution's case and showing you that, these characters it's the wrong characters on trial, that these are not journals, they're not a documentary, they're stories that have been made up for another purpose. And so in this final lecture today, I want to set the record straight by bringing in two more expert witnesses, a mythologist and a Jungian analyst, to speak in defense of the real God. So that's where we're going in this final lecture today. So firstly, I want to bring in a mythologist. And I want to preface it by saying this, that people who dismiss myth in favor of science understand neither. If you think that myth is just made up gobbledygook and that science, has all the answers, you don't understand either the science or you don't understand mythology. And so it is really, really important that I bring in this mythologist to speak to us about what is the real beauty, what is the value, and what is the wisdom of mythology, And in the last part of my book, I set science free. I won't have time to do that, unfortunately, in this retreat, but that's where I headed in the book. So I want to talk then about the importance of myth, of story, of proverb, and of parable. So those of you in the COJ community have heard me tell this story on several occasions. In the summer of 1963, between my junior and senior years in high school, I spent the entire summer in a part of Ireland, a place called COJ, in which Gaelic is still the spoken language. It's the mother tongue there. So I was raised in a mixture of Gaelic and English. And in fact, all of my education to the end of high school was through the medium of Irish or Gaelic. And so I spent many summers in areas where it was the spoken language, the language of everyday people, in a village called COJ. And I set out to collect proverbs. And at the end of the summer, I collected 432 proverbs, which the school actually printed in a little booklet subsequently. And I would visit the elders all over the village in the outlying areas, old men and old women. And I'd ask them, share with me some proverbs, and then tell me the context in which this proverb might be used, and how to unpack it or how to interpret it, for modern life. And I always remember one old man telling me, he said, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the Proverbs. And it's really, really true. If Christianity had never come to Ireland, the wisdom contained in the Proverbs would have given us everything we needed to know in order to live love-filled lives. And I would say the same thing about my time in Africa. Having had the privilege of learning 4 African languages and steeping myself in very different tribal mythologies, I would say the same thing. If missionaries had never brought Christianity to Africa, Africa could live according to our Proverbs and our wisdom tradition. So I'm totally convinced that all of the mythologies of the world, all of the folklores of the world are as much the revealed word of God as is the Bhagavad Gita or the Holy Quran, or the Torah or the New Testament. God speaks all languages, and reveals herself through all cultures and all kinds of wisdom. And so it's very important then that the mythologists help us to understand what the true meaning of the Bible is, and therefore understand who God really is, not this caricature, that the prosecution has created and that religion has created before that. And one of the things I discovered about Proverbs as I kind of studied them in many languages was that Proverbs frequently contradict each other, for the simple reason that truth is so multifaceted that you can say A is true in one context and A is not true in another context. And so it's an apparent contradiction only because there are many facets to the diamond of truth. And I give you a few examples. In Gaelic, we say, Bíonn blas ar chuid an chorsan. There's a special taste to the neighbor's food. When you're a little child, and you're visiting your friend's house and you're served food in your neighbor's house, it always tastes a lot better than the stuff you're getting at home. But we also say, Ní léinn tín tán mar de hín tán féin. There is no fireside like your own fireside. When you're done eating in your neighbor's house, you want to come home and be with mommy and daddy and your brothers and sisters. And so they appear to contradict each other, but they're just dealing with different situations, and both of them are true in different contexts. In English, we say, look before you leap. But we also say, he who hesitates is lost. And so there's a time, to look and be careful about what you're going to do. And there's a time to follow your instinct and not kind of, you hear a car coming behind you, you jump on, off the roadway and not kind of think it through and check it out. And so they appear to contradict each other, but they actually don't. There are truths that are pertinent for different situations. In Swahili, we have a proverb that says, haraka, haraka, haina baraka. Hurry, hurry has no blessing. You rush things, you're not going to have any blessing attached. But we also say in Swahili, chilewa, chilewa, mtoto si wako, which means delay, delay, and the baby will not be yours. And it comes from a tradition where, it is the dream of every African girl to become a mother. And so if she gets married and the guy doesn't consummate the marriage, she's not going to wait around twirling her thumbs. She wants to be a mother. So chilewa, chilewa, mtoto si wako, delay, delay, and the baby will not be yours. And so again and again and again, Proverbs apparently contradict each other, except they're not. They're just speaking to different environments in which they may be true. Now, you understand that about Proverbs. Then the importance of storytelling is that a really good storyteller, exaggerates wildly in order to make a point, particularly if there's a moral attached to the story, or a lesson to be learned from the story. And so great storytellers, do a few things. They activate our imagination. So we're traveling with them. We're not just listening to what they're saying. We're traveling in our own imaginations, and we're recreating the scene that they're verbally articulating. So your own imagination is vitally important. But the storyteller is going to wildly exaggerate constantly. And I've used this example with you already. When Jesus is talking about temptation and the importance of avoiding temptation to move into, darkness, he says, if your right eye scandalize you, pluck it out and throw it away. Better to enter into hell's fire, with one eye, than to have to enter into heaven with one eye, than to go into hell with two eyes. If your right leg scandalize you, cut it off and throw it away. Better to get to heaven with one leg than to be in hell with two legs. Now, if you take that literally, you're going to find that heaven is populated by blind amputees. And so here's Jesus constantly exaggerating wildly, saying stuff like, it's harder for a rich man to get to heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. So, he's constantly exaggerating what he's saying. And therefore, when you begin to unpack the Bible stories, you have to realize that there's wild exaggeration going because they're teaching modalities. And you have to try to isolate the core teaching and lesson, and strip away the exaggeration, whether that's about Moses or the Exodus or whatever. And so you understand then that stories and proverbs, and parables and myth, they're trying to help us, explain the present situation in which we find ourselves. Whether we're in exile in Babylon, or we've emigrated to the United States of America from Ireland, or we're, suffering from an illness or whatever. It is stories that we tell ourselves or others tell us are to try to make sense of the present moment in which we find ourselves. They're to help us remember the past or even invent a past that will inspire us for the future. So that's the function of storytelling. Storytelling crosses three timelines: the past, the present, and the future. It explains how we got to where we are right now. It explains the present moment. It invents or remembers the past, and it creates heroes and heroines. And then it inspires us to set out for the future. And so to understand the Bible, you have to understand storytelling. And you have to understand proverb and myth and parable. And therefore, as you unpack it, you have to learn to listen to the Bible, not with your intellect primarily, but with your heart and with your imagination. You have to go, I've said many times to you, you have to go trans-rational. And by trans-rational, I do not mean irrational. You're not abandoning the mind, you're using the mind and then going beyond the mind. You have to go trans-spatial. You have to step out of space. You have to visit the lands at the time in which these events are happening. You have to go trans-temporal, step outside of time. And you have to go trans-personal. You have to cease identifying with this particular spacesuit in which you now find yourself and realize that this is just a role you're playing, but that there's a soul self behind that, and there's a source self even behind that. And so imagination is the vehicle through which we step outside of time, outside of space, outside of imagination, and outside of personal identification. And you actually do that on a regular basis when you're dreaming at night. Dreams are trans-temporal, they're trans-spatial, they're trans-rational, and they're taking you into totally different times and totally different spaces. Now, if you really want to read the Bible, you have to learn how to do all those things. You can't just open the book and read a passage and say, oh my God, this is terrible stuff. And this is why, to go back again and again and again, you can't abandon the Hebrew scriptures and dismiss them as being evidence for a pathological homicidal divinity. Because you have to dig a lot deeper and go a lot. You have to listen to the Bible with your soul self. As I say, not just with your rational mind, but you have to listen to all of these stories, exaggerations of various kinds, inventions of various kinds, because there are deep teachings in them when you learn how to mind them properly. So with that kind of introduction, I want to look then at the notion of the myth of God, the myth of Moses, and the myth of the Exodus. So the story of Exodus is an extraordinary exaggeration of a great fable. The story of an escape from an oppressive power. And I'll come back to that again and again and again. And so the story, the fable, the myth, says that 2 million people escaped from Egypt, the greatest power on the planet at that stage, that owned the entire Sinai Peninsula, and had a huge standing army. And there were 2 million people. Now, let me unpack that as a mathematician. If 2 million people were to set out walking 10 abreast and socially distancing by staying 6 feet away from the row in front of them, it is 263 miles from Cairo to Jerusalem. If they were socially distancing and walking 10 abreast, not to mention their cattle and livestock, the first row would be in Jerusalem before the last group met the Red Sea. So that's the nature of this extraordinary exaggeration. There is no way this could actually have happened physically. So it's very important then, if you really want to dig into the Bible, there is a key period in Jewish history from which Judaism builds backwards into a fictitious past and forward into an inspired, hopeful future. And that period of time, it is vitally important to understand. It is between 587 BCE and 539 BCE. Between 587 BCE and 539 BCE. Because in 587 BCE, the last two tribes of Israel, Judah and Benjamin, are taken into exile in Babylon. And they're set free in the year 539 BCE by the Persians, who overthrew the Babylonians and set the remnant of Israel free to go back to the land of Israel and rebuild their temple. And it is in this like 50-year period that all of this great mythology is created. At this stage, the Sabbath is invented. There is no Sabbath in Judaism before this period of time. They invent the Sabbath, the clean day of the week to honor God. They invent the distinction between kosher and treif, kosher being clean foods and treif being stuff that you're not allowed to eat. It gets invented at this stage. Table fellowship gets invented at this stage. The notion that the Israelites cannot have table fellowship with anybody else because it's going to dilute the gene pool. They're going to marry off and they're going to disappear like the 10 northern tribes disappeared. So they invent table fellowship. And they invent circumcision at this stage to separate out their own menfolk from the menfolk around them. So there's these 4, 5 great inventions that happen during this period of time. And it allows Judaism to survive as a separate ethnic group with their own religion and their own spirituality. It is vitally important. And from that period of time, they look backwards and they invent Moses and they invent the Exodus and they invent all the great heroes of the past in order to give them courage for the present moment and inspiration for the future. So all of the great stories and all the great heroes are invented at this stage. Now they'll put the entire book of Deuteronomy into the mouth of Moses. They will claim that Moses wrote the entire Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So they'll invent all these great heroes and they'll invent the Exodus. We've done it before, guys. We can do it again. We can go back again to the land of Israel because we've done it in the past. And God will give us a great leader. And indeed, God gave them great leaders to come back. Ezra and Nehemiah will lead them back from this captivity. So at this stage, they're going to invent a whole new stream of biblical literature that is called by scholars, it's called the P stream, P as in priestly stream. So they'll invent a whole bunch of laws and rituals that will sustain them during their exile and sustain them when they get back and rebuild the temple, which will happen about the year 515 BCE. So they're going to invent this into a new stream of scripture. Then they're going to combine the 4 streams. They're going to combine the J stream, in which God is called Yahweh. They're going to put that with the E stream, in which God is called Elohim. They're going to add the Deuteronomic stream, which is the second law, and they're going to append the priestly stream, the ritual, and they're going to put all of these together. And they're going to update it with a whole bunch of new stories, or they're going to invent a bunch of stories, and then they're going to edit really badly, actually, the entire compendium in order to provide, like, this is the manual for our survival and our journey back. And as I say, it'll actually be very badly edited because frequently you're going to find 2 or 3 versions of exactly the same story, just juxtaposed side by side. And so part of this period then is to invent an exodus from Egypt in order to fortify them for the exodus, which is now coming up in 539 BCE, when the remnant of Israel is going to go back to the land of Israel, about 50,000 people who chose to come back. And they're going to now have to rebuild their temple, which they do. And so in some senses, this Exodus story and this Moses character, Moses may well be the greatest liberator of all time. It's a story of tyranny and oppression. It's a story of liberation and freedom. And it's a repeating cycle throughout human history. Again and again and again in human history, there have been entire cultures, entire countries that have been tyrannized, oppressed, and colonized. And in some senses, every century since has had its own version of this tyranny and this slavery, including our own times right now. And so the myth of Moses and the myth of the Exodus is as important in 2022 as it was in 539 BCE. So again and again and again, we in our times have to identify and oppose oppression of any kind because it is soul destroying. We have to claim our freedom because it's precious and it's our birthright. So mythology is the archetype of inspiration. Mythology is not just mishegas made up by primitive peoples who are pre-scientific. If you understand mythology, you realize that mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture. And it is really, really important. It's what explains the past, allows us to understand the present, and gives us hope for the future. So that is what the mythologists had to contribute, to understanding who God is and who the characters in the Hebrew scriptures are. And then the final expert witness that he brought in is a Jungian analyst. And he wanted this analyst particularly to address the issue of the shadow and of projection. So Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychologist, was, I believe, was the greatest psychologist of the 20th century. He invented the notion of the complex of projection and of the shadow, the notion of archetypes, and the collective unconscious. So Carl Jung's collective unconscious is the equivalent of the Hindu notion of the Akashic records. And so he talked about the shadow, and Carl Jung claimed that the shadow is 80% gold and 20% repressed traumata, or the kind of the selfishness inside in each person, or inside each culture, or inside each nation. And so, but it is very difficult to see what lies inside in our own personal heart. So we have to learn how to project it outwards. And at the risk of boring you to death, I've said again and again and again, there are two ways of watching a movie. You can go into a movie theater and sit down in a comfortable seat and watch the screen, 40 feet by 30 feet, and you watch this movie happening. And there's an illusion of movement and time and change and dialogue and characters and color that you're watching. Now, that's actually a projection. It's not happening up there. It's happening up in the projectionist box. So if you go up to the projectionist box and you take this celluloid roll and you go through it frame by frame by frame, 1 inch by 1 inch, you're seeing the same movie. But it's a radically different experience because there's no sense from frame to frame, there's no sense of a difference. So you don't see change and you don't see time and you don't see movement. And so you shine a white light through it and you project it onto a screen, you magnify it, and therefore you can see much, much more clearly what's contained on the celluloid roll. Now, if you think you can actually intervene and that the action is happening up there and you attempt to intervene, I've told you the story about as a little child growing up in Cork City in Ireland in the late 1940s and early 1950s, there was a movie theater in Cork City called the Lido. Unless you think that the Lido was this beautiful, theater, Italian style with cushy seats and, a beautiful screen. It was a big barn of a building with wooden benches and a concrete whitewashed wall on which they projected the movies. And on Saturday mornings, there were special movies for the children, typically cowboy and Indian movies or Tarzan movies. And the price of admission was 2 milk bottles. Milk was delivered in the cities in glass milk bottles. And if you washed the bottles and presented them, that was your ticket into the movie theater. You didn't have to spend any money. So we went into the movie theater, but we filled our pockets, all the boys filled our pockets with stones and pebbles of various kinds. And the movie starts up, and when the bad guy comes on screen and he's crawling up behind the good guy and the good guy can't see him, we'd start shouting encouragement, "Look out behind you, he's right behind you." And of course, the good guy didn't take notice of us. So we took out our stones and we started pelting the screen at the bad guy. And after about 2 minutes of this, the movie would stop and the house lights would come on and a big burly steward would come in and just randomly pick out 2 or 3 boys and kick them out of the movie theater. And then the movie would start up again and we'd bide our time, sitting on our backsides for maybe another 10 minutes, and then we couldn't resist it anymore. And out would come the stones and we'd start pelting it again. So this might happen 3 or 4 times during the course of a movie. Now, that's what we have. That's what we're doing as human beings. We're watching a movie which we're projecting from our own psyches onto other people, and then we're throwing stones at them. When we do that as individuals in individual relationships, we create interpersonal problems with another one person. When an entire community does that and projects onto a different community, it's called prejudice. So we're creating prejudice as a group. And when we do this as a human community, as a species, we create what Buddhism would call a tulpa. A tulpa is the personification or the coagulation of the projected dark matter of the entire species. And it has its own identity, it has its own energy, and it has its own personality. And all of these individual tulpas meet together and they create this giant tulpa, which then interferes with the human species. It is constantly interfering energetically with everybody who lives under its influence. It's like, a naughty kid that goes out to find other naughty kids in the neighborhood and they create a gang. And then the gang starts terrorizing the elderly in the village. So that's what's happening, except it's happening at a global level. And I've used the example of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a patch of rubbish, mainly plastics, that have been dumped off ships and from the west coast of the United States and the east coast of Asia. And because of the gyroscopic nature of the tides in that area, it swirls around. And the land mass at this stage is bigger than the state of Texas. And that's poisoning fish who are eaten by bigger fish, whom we are catching. And you're putting them, you go to your kind of a butcher shop on the Sunday, and you go to the fish section and you're eating your own garbage. All of us, we're eating our own garbage, recycled garbage. And that's what we're doing energetically. To the extent that we're projecting our shadow material as an entire species, we're then feasting on that and we're poisoning ourselves. And that's what we've done with the scriptures. The human species have projected all their own shadow material onto this God in the sky. And then we've recycled this God, and this God has fed us, and this God has poisoned us. Because it's a tulpa. It's a giant cosmic tulpa that humanity has created, upon which we're feeding. And we think we're being nurtured, by the stories we've created, the projections that we've kind of latched onto this entity. So Carl Jung made the point that projection is merely the first half of a two-stage process. You project onto somebody else in order to see clearly what lies inside in your own psyche. Because instead of looking at, 1 inch by 1 inch, frames, you see it much more clearly when you see it in somebody else. And so the second part is to say, thank you for willing to be a screen that I can project my darkness onto, so I can see my own darkness, so that I can now own it and work on it. And this has to be true as an individual, on an individual basis. It has to be true on a cultural basis, and has to be true on a species-wide basis. And certainly it has to be true for all of the religions of the world that have projected all their own dark material onto this sky being whom they call God. And so at this stage, we need to re-own that stuff and realize that this God is actually a projection of the human shadow material. To use another kind of an image, it's as if, imagine I'm having respiratory difficulties and chest disorders, I'm coughing, and I finally go to the doctor and he sends me to get my chest x-rayed. And the radiographer shows me the x-ray and I got TB. Now, I can have one of three reactions to that. When I look at the x-ray, I can get mad at the doctor and punch him out. I can tear up the evidence of the x-ray, but I still have TB. Or I can realize, okay, now I know what the problem is. Now I can go and I can fix it. And so in some senses, that is what projection is about. Projection is about, x-raying every relationship of which I am a part. Individual relationships, it is x-raying the relationship between humans and nature, and then seeing, what the disease might be on our part. It is x-raying, making an x-ray of our relationship with God, and then seeing what the disease is, because it's our disease, it's not God's disease. And so finally, at the end of the trial, the judge, having listened to the three experts for the prosecution and the 4 experts for the defense, pounds his gavel and calls for order and says, when there's dead silence in this court, God is the projected image of humanity. Set God free. Hence the title of the book. So I need to correct you, Robbie. I didn't say that anybody who speaks to God is psychotic. I said anybody who claims that God is speaking to them and telling them to do evil or to commit murder is psychotic. God does speak, but God never asked anybody, to do a murder. So we can speak to God, and God does speak to us. But anybody who claims that God told them, to strap on a suicide belt and go into a busload of children and blow it up, that's a psychotic behavior. So it's not psychotic to speak to God, and it's not psychotic to claim that we can hear the voice of God. It's mysticism is listening to God's voice, and talking to God, is a form of prayer and a form of meditation. So I distinguish then between prayer and meditation. So, to say anything about God really is, in some senses, it's made up. There are basically 4 languages that are employed when we're trying to deal with the phenomenon of source. And the 4 languages are, in Greek, they're called the cataphatic language. Cataphatic language is the language of the theologians, the language that claims we can say who God is and what God said and what God does and how God feels about things. That's called cataphatic language. It's the language that claims that they can figure out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. The second kind of language is apophatic language, and that's the language of the mystics. In Hinduism, it is called neti neti, not this, not that. X, no, God is not X. Y, God is not Y. Z, God is not Y. So apophatic language is the realization that you can't capture God in human words. The third kind of language is parabolic language, the language of parable. So if you're going to be a teacher, you're going to have to put some kinds of words to the experiences you're having. And so a great teacher like Jesus will constantly make up stories and parables and myth. And so he's employing a language that I call parabolic language, or the language of parable. So you have to do that if you're a teacher. If you're a mystic living in the Himalayas in a cave who never has to kind of interface with people, you don't need any kind of language except apophatic, neti neti. God is not X, God is not Y, God is not Z. And the fourth kind of language is the language of sociology or history, as you try to explain the evolution of our understanding of God throughout human history. So that's a fourth kind of language. So you have to be really, really careful then when we're talking of God, what language are we employing? And the best thing we can say is that we can certainly try to distinguish between the transcendence of God, which is utterly ineffable, and the immanence of God, as she manifests herself through her creation, through the cosmos itself. Now, every single one of us can have experiences of the transcendent God, but we cannot articulate any of them. Because, if you have a mystical experience, and many people do, you have to realize that you're not actually having a mystical experience. The mystical experience is having you. It is not I whom having a mystical experience. I am being had by a mystical experience. And so when I'm in the experience, I'm just totally none of my sensorium is working. None of my cognitive faculties are working. None of my emotions are employed. I am totally, in the now of the everlasting. Now, as I begin to come out of it, I'm left with some kind of residual symbol of it. Light might be a symbol of it. So that's the next stage out from it. And then I'm going to try to make sense of the symbol. So I'm going to create a concept. I'm going to call it light. And then at some stage, I'm going to put together a whole bunch of concepts and create a theology. Now, by the time I get to the theology, I'm 3 stages away from the experience. And that's the problem. So I believe that meditation is when we allow God to speak to us. And prayer is when we attempt to speak back to God. And so in some senses, meditation is the immanent addressing meditation is the transcendent addressing the immanent, and prayer is the immanent addressing the transcendent. And so there is a dialogue going on. We initiate it insofar as we pray and we create a space for the meditation, and then God responds, by using our meditation in order to kind of give an experience of his transcendence. Yeah, it is gruesome stuff, absolutely gruesome stuff. And again, many times I've said that I see there's a cycle to to all great movements, whether they're religious movements or secular movements. There's always a great cycle. So let's stay with with religion and spirituality for a moment. Every great religion is based on some kind of a mystical insight. There comes an avatar of some kind, a Buddha figure or a Jesus figure, a charismatic individual who is like a moving tabernacle of transcendence. And they come and their teachings are so, attractive and so inspiring that a group of companions gather around them. And so there's the guru or the avatar, or the spiritual person, and there's a group of followers like the 12 disciples of Jesus. Inevitably the avatar dies and very frequently is actually killed, because the avatar is always a thorn in the side of the status quo, particularly religious figures, pre-existing religious figures. And so frequently the avatar is killed. In the case of Jesus, he's crucified. Now at this stage, you've got people who gathered around Jesus. Now they're leaderless in some way. And so in order to maintain some kind of cohesion, they create some kind of an organization to hold them together. And then they're going to either elect leaders, or there's going to be self-appointed leaders who take charge of the organization. And that's the next stage of the process. And then at some stage, the organization is going to insist on some kind of creedal formulation. In order to be one of us, you have to believe A and B and C and D, like the Nicene Creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, etc. So they create some kind of a creedal formulation. And everybody, to be a member of the group, you have to subscribe to that creedal formulation. And that then becomes orthodoxy of various kinds. If the group becomes powerful enough that they are able to do it, they're going to set up inquisitions against members within their own community who have different viewpoints. And we had that in spades in the Middle Ages, in the Roman Catholic Church, where literally people were pulled asunder on machines of torture, for not being orthodox in their belief system or not believing. So at some stage, if the organization gets so powerful that it's able to visit its will on those outsiders, then you get crusades. And so they're going to export the death killing and the murder and the mayhem outside of their own group, and then there'll be crusades and conquistadores. And then at some stage, there'll be somebody within the group, another prophet who wakes up and says, guys, this is not how we started off. This was not the message of the master. And so you get a character like Francis of Assisi in the 1200s, meeting the Pope at the time and say, this is not what the master taught in Galilee, 1200 years ago. And so he begins a whole new movement called the Franciscan Order. So Francis flourished around the year 1200. He set up the Franciscan Order. Within 200 years, the Franciscan Order was in charge of the Inquisition. They were literally pulling Christians limb from limb apart, visiting all over Europe, and they were the ones who were driving the Inquisition, aided and abetted by the Dominicans, which were founded around the same time by St. Dominic. So you these two great, kind of prophetic figures, St. Dominic and St. Francis, creating a reform movement of the Catholic Church, and they go through the very same cycle again and again and again. And you see that happening in politics. You see it happening in the business model. You see it happen in Silicon Valley. You get people like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who create an extraordinary idea in a garage, and then they manage it, and there's this excitement, and they bring in people, long-haired people, shaggy people who are smoking pot or whatever, and they create this extraordinary, computer system. And then when it starts to get successful, they fire Jobs and they bring in a real guy who will wear a collar and tie, and shape up and lick people into shape. And then it becomes a capitalistic venture. And then you get Silicon Valley as it is today. So every movement, whether it's a technological movement, a spiritual movement, a financial movement, or whatever, is subject to this cycle of going from the avatar and the mystical impulse, to kind of tyranny and oppression. And so that's what happens again and again. So to answer your question directly, it happens in all religious systems, inevitably. And inevitably, there's going to be a need for a new prophet to call us back to our origins, to call us back to the mystical impulse that gave birth to religion. And I'll actually deal with that, tomorrow. The final lecture is setting spirituality free, and I'll go into that in some more detail, Trish. There are three great questions that you folded in. And the truth is that we're all projecting all the time. And that is how we see what's inside in ourselves. We can't not project. Yeah. Otherwise, if we don't project, we don't see what's inside in our own hearts. The question is, can I retroject after I've projected? But I have to project. So I need a screen. Now, the thing is, when I project onto another individual person, there has to be some kind of a hook. You know, I'm not going to project, you know, anger and evil onto the Dalai Lama. You know, there has to be something, some hook that my anger and judgment can attach to. So it is not to say that the other person is 100% guilty of what I'm attributing to them, but there is something in that person, you know, that hooks my projection. Otherwise, it's not going to stick, and you're not going to be able to see what it is. So that's the first consideration. Understand that all of us are moving screens. All of us are less than perfect. And therefore, all of us are going to present sides of ourselves that present, you know, adequate hooks for somebody else's, you know, shadow protections on me. So the screen on which I'm projecting must deal with their own material. So I have to project all the time. Now, the second part of it is, as I said, the shadow is 80% gold. It is 80% unrealized potential and 20%, you know, suppressed traumata, our personal darkness. And so we project onto our heroes and our heroines, whether they're political figures, or athletes, or actors of various kinds. And there are some groups who go out of their way to be screens for the adulation, the projection of adulation. Politicians do this all the time. Hollywood does this all the time. Many athletes do this all the time. They're they get off on being screens onto which other people can project heroism. So we have to be really, really careful about the heroes and the heroines that we kind of slavishly follow, particularly politicians, in my opinion, and particularly Hollywood, and particularly on the tech industry at this stage. And so, you know, to answer the third part of your question then, they're actively creating propaganda because they've taken control over the mass media and the social media. And so they're in control of the narrative. So they can determine what the narrative is. And so they'll tell you on whom to project your dark shadow, whom to vilify. And if that's all you're getting, you're going to have favorite villains in your life, and you're going to demonize those people. And I've said to you many, many times that there are 4 stages to fundamentalism, whether that's in politics or in business or in finance or in religion. There are always 4 stages to it. The first stage is you take a very, very complex phenomenon and you reduce it to a bumper sticker. The second stage is then you either identify or create an enemy figure. The third stage is you demonize the enemy figure. They're less than human. And the fourth stage is you make war on the enemy. And you see that constantly in the political realm. You see it, you know, in the mass media, and you see it in religions, internecine warfare, you know, religious warfares. There's always 4 steps to the process. You take a concept like God, this extraordinary, transcendent, unimaginable, ineffable reality, and you reduce it down to a bumper sticker. You know, this is God. God is angry with you. Jesus is coming back, and he's really upset. And then who's to blame for this? And you find out it's the Jews in Christian history. You know, the Jews are the problem. And that's stage 2. Then stage 3 is you got to demonize them. They're not really human beings. Actually, they're rodents. They actually carry disease. And so you got to herd them into ghettos, you know, in Poland and in Russia. And then you go and you pogroms and you kill them all, get rid of them, the final solution. Now, that's repeated again and again and again in the human journey, in religions, in politics, and in other areas. So I hope that addresses all 3 parts of your question, Joanna. Well, firstly, Christ says, by their fruits you shall know them. Look at the output, the end outcome, you know, of the person or the group or whatever, you know. And secondly, it is through research. You have to research to make sure that your viewpoint of the other person or the organization is based on real data. You know, so you have to make sure that you're trawling many different systems in order to kind of get the data to form your impression of the others. So basically, you look at what the fruits of their efforts are, and you can tell fairly quickly. Is it creating love in our world? Is it creating, is it abusing freedoms? Is it leading to tyranny? Or is it leading to joy and to happiness and freedom? So you're going to see very quickly by the fruits. Both of the above, Martha, because for one thing, part of the projection is that we're being educated in order to react in specific ways to specific people or specific, situations. So I know that you have a strong political background yourself. You understand this very, very well. You know that every human conflict is multifaceted, and there's a long, long history. So in order to understand any even current situation, we have to understand the antecedents to it, and we have to understand what the agendas of the various parties are, and who has access and control over the propaganda, because there's propaganda coming from all sides on these issues. And so somehow researching it and being open to a multiplicity of perspectives on any issue. And then realizing that, part of me, what I'm responding to is I'm going to play favorites. I have prejudice of various kinds because I'm Irish and Catholic, and Christian or whatever. So I'm going to have inbuilt prejudices when I experience any conflict situation, whether it's an interreligious dynamic between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, or whether it's, the conduct of World War II in Europe, or the colonization of Ireland by the British, or the slave trade from Africa to America. I have a history of my own, and I'm bringing all of that, to what I project. So I'm projecting all of my personal knowledge, and I'm projecting all of the propaganda to which I've been subjected. And so I've said many times that there are 7 different timelines that we're dealing with. There are 2 timelines in the past. There are 2 timelines in the present, and there are 3 timelines in the future. So the 2 timelines of the past are the actual past that actually happened. And then there's the historical past, the past as recorded by the winners. And they're very different. But we are, we're influenced by both kinds of past. We're products of what really went down, and we're products of the stories we were told about what went down. And so the past is influencing us right now in 2 ways. The kind of the real events of human history that really happened, and then the stories that we were educated in our geography classes or in our history classes. That's the 2 versions of the past. There are 2 versions of the present. There is what's really happening in our world right now. And there is the propaganda we're being told to explain what is happening in our world right now. And we're being influenced by both of them. Every single one of us is being influenced by what is really happening now. Even if we're not aware of it, it affects the energy of the planet. It affects this tulpa, which is like in some senses, an uterus to which we are attached and from which we are drawing sustenance. Our poison. And so we're products of what really is happening right now, even if we're not aware of what's happening right now. And we're products of what we're being told is happening right now by the various propaganda machines that are articulating their particular perspective, on what's happening right now. So we're victims of both the real present and the propagandized present. And then there are 3 versions of the future. There's the notion that we're living in a fated inevitability, that the future is set in stone, and that we're merely mouthing pre-scripted lines in a pre-programmed plot as human beings, and that there's no way we can avoid what's going to happen. Now, I do not believe such a future exists. I do not believe in a pre-programmed future. I believe rather that there are only 2 kinds of future. There's the probable future, which is likely to happen if we don't change what we're doing. And there's the possible future that could happen if we do change what we're doing. So in some senses, the present moment is the net result of all of the decisions made by all of the human beings in the entire trajectory of Homo sapiens. We are the result of that. And the present moment and all of the decisions that 7.8 billion people are making right now are going to create the probable future. This is what's likely to happen if we keep doing what we're doing right now. If we change what we're doing right now, we could create a possible future. The question is, what kind of a possible future do we have in mind? Is it a biased possible future, which is still influenced by my own prejudices, from my culture or whatever? Or is it a possible future which is predicated on God and love and compassion and multi-perspectiving? Because one of the primary kind of indicators of a spiritual evolution is the ability to multi-perspective, because God perspectives from every one of her creatures. Creation is simply every word of God made flesh is simply another perspective God is having on her creation. So God is constantly multi-perspectiving. And that's one of the great symbols of somebody who is moving along the evolutionary trajectory toward enlightenment, the ability to inhabit many different perspectives, not necessarily to agree with every one of them or any one of them, but to be able to walk in somebody else's moccasins and understand what their perspective might say. So the question then becomes for me is, how much more propaganda are we going to be influenced by? And how do we escape the propaganda and manage to actually plug in to the heart of God and to listen to love messages and compassion, even if compassion sometimes involves confrontation, and it does. I've said to you that there are 4 phases of compassion. There is confirmation, attaboy, you're doing a great job. There is cooperation, where you're a member of a team. There is compensation, where you pick up the ball when somebody drops it. And there's confrontation, when somebody is really screwing up and creating problems for others. And so operating out of compassion and out of love. That is the possible future we could create. We have no guarantees. We have no idea, for instance, how the present configuration of the warmongers in our world right now, are going to lead us into a future, whether it's going to be a World War III or it's going to be a Homo spiritualis. But you and I, we can add to it by, creating our own perspective and pulling in a specific direction. I'll make a few responses, even though you didn't ask questions. You made a brilliant contribution. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you.
I have a friend of mine years and years and years ago. She decided she wanted to write a book, and she knew what the title of it was, but she actually never wrote the book. But the title was Stay Asleep, Waking Up Sucks. That was going to be the title of her book. So I totally agree with you. It's a daunting task. However, I am totally convinced that every soul on planet Earth volunteered to be here now. None of us is here by happenstance, by accident, but 99% of us are asleep at the wheel. But we looked into human history and we decided to parachute into human history at this precise time, in this precise situation, because we wanted to try to move the stuck wheels of the chariot, along the road of enlightenment. But 99% of us are asleep. And I've said again that there's only one sin. I don't believe that sin is the transgression of precept or the breaking of commandments. I don't believe that for a minute. I believe there's only one sin. And the sin is the refusal to wake up. All of the other stuff is just corollaries to that, or tertiary versions of it, epiphenomena. There's only one sin. It's the refusal to wake up. And I agree fully with you, Dee, that it really sucks. While we're excited by the fact that the world could be different, we're resentful of the fact that who's going to do it? I'm always aware of people who come across a situation and say, why doesn't somebody do something about that? Whether there's rubbish on the streets or whatever, and I'm thinking, well, you're a person. Why aren't you doing something about it? And so why aren't you picking up the litter? All of you remember, most of you remember Kathleen Lyons, the great, one of the great founders of COJ. Kathleen Lyons had a practice that she told me one time. Every time she went into a bathroom, in a public bathroom, she cleaned it up. Whatever rubbish was in the bathroom, she cleaned it up. Now, the rest of us would go into the bathroom and come back and say, that bathroom is in a disgusting shape. Why doesn't somebody do something about it? Well, Kathleen did. And so we all find ourselves in a situation where we ask, why isn't somebody doing something about it? You're a somebody, I'm a somebody, everybody is a somebody. So we have to create little groups. Now, the good news is there are thousands of little groups like us scattered all over the world. And what we need to do is start networking with each other, because the future of spirituality is not mega churches that, seat 4,000 people in auditoria. The future of spirituality is small little communities like ours networking with each other, and learning from each other. and they are myriad right now. So those of us who feel isolated, and that, you know, that as a little community, there's not a whole lot we can do about it. We need to be reaching out and realizing there are many, 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 many others like us. I remember watching the Pioneers as a group that meets in San Rafael every year. And they look at how we learn from nature, you know, how to do life properly, you know, and there's attorneys there are psychologists there are kind of scientists there, you know, there are teachers there are medical people there, and they're all looking to nature, you know, to see, you know, how we can, you know, learn to make our world a better place. And I remember attending a lecture there. It normally goes from a Friday evening to a Sunday morning. And the Sunday morning lecture was the last lecture of the day. And the guy who was giving the lecture was talking about all of these communities scattered throughout the world who are trying to make life better on planet Earth. And as he's talking, an hour and a half lecture, there's a list of names scrolling down behind him on the screen. It's like when you go to a movie theater, and at the end of the movie, you know, they're showing you, you know, who the cameraman went, who the best boy was, you know, who's in charge of our, you know, special effects or whatever. And it's scrolling down like for maybe 10 minutes, so fast you can't read it. And the same was happening on the screen for an hour and a half behind him, all these names scrolling down. And at the end of his lecture, he said, you may be wondering why I let the screen scroll down behind me during my lecture. That is a list of all the groups that I have identified all over the world who are trying to make a difference in law, in agriculture, in medicine, you know, in education, in politics, in religion. That's a list of groups that I've put together. Some of these groups only have 40 members. Some of them have 10,000 members. And he said, I could let that scroll down for the next 3 days and you still wouldn't meet the end of that list. That's how many people are actually out there. But we're not communicating with each other. We're not networking with each other. And so we feel like we're isolated. We're only isolated because we're not creating the kind of the neural network of a global brain in which every neuron in the brain is capable of making contact with every other neuron in the brain. And there are millions of them. And so we can create literally trillions of circuits in the human brain. And we can create trillions of circuits on the global brain of the planet by reaching out for other communities like ourselves.